Good afternoon. It's Saturday, October 26, 2024. My name is Vincent Slatt. I'm the Director of Archiving with the Rainbow History Project. We're talking today in Dupont Circle, which is in Washington, D.C., the historic lands of the Nacotchtank and Anacostan peoples who were displaced by the white colonists. This is the Dupont Circle neighborhood that we find ourselves in. We're going to be talking about that today. I'm joined by Professor Theo Greene from Bowdoin College, the chair of the Sociology department, and we're talking about his new book, Not in My Gayborhood, Gay Neighborhoods and the Rise of the Vicarious Citizen. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Greene.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be back after such a long time.
How are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you. And yourself?
Wonderful. I'm doing pretty well.
Good.
The weather is not very good, but everything is fine.
I disagree. I come from Portland, Maine.
Here we go.
Temperature dropped 40 degrees, so I'm happy to be here.
All right. We're going to be talking about the book today, a lot of different questions and answers between us, and then I think we'll open it up to our live studio audience for a few more questions and just kind of see how things go.
Fantastic.
Okay. Our first question today is actually about some of the terms, vicarious citizen. Mm-hmm. This is a new theory that you've developed over the years with a lot of research into other people's scholarship, other people's recordings, mm-hmm. and with dozens of interviews that you have done with other people. So I want to start by kind of asking you big picture, if people are going to walk away and explain vicarious citizen, what exactly is that, and how did you come up with that term and that idea?
Yes. Vicarious citizenship is basically thinking about non-residential forms of belonging. So one of the things that animated my research from the very beginning was the fact that when we talked about gay neighborhoods, we often focused on residency. So as we're thinking about, Dupont Circle no longer becoming the gay neighborhood, the reason was often that people were moving from Dupont Circle into Logan Circle, into Shaw, into other parts of the community. However, one of the things I found when I was conducting my interviews was the fact that many people, even though they felt comfortable living throughout the district, often felt their heart being anchored in Dupont Circle because of the public presence. And many people sort of felt such a strong connection to it, they actually acted like real residents of the community. They had the same kinds of investments, the same kinds of emotional attachments. They weren't afraid to raise their voices when their favorite establishments are closing, or if they are encountering people that are behaving in a way that doesn't align with their vision of community. And so I developed this notion of vicarious citizenship, and even though it is a new term, one of the things I've done throughout my research is realize it's not a new thing, right? For a long time, LGBT people, queer people in cities have always created communities out of spaces they did not live in residentially, but they lived their lives out in the city in a very vital way. And so you can think about the fact that many of the gay neighborhoods, even as they became gay neighborhoods in the 70s, were gentrifying quickly, and many people couldn't access them residentially. They had to live around those neighborhoods, adjacent to those neighborhoods. But in the evenings, they would come into those spaces to participate as part of the nightlife. So that is how I developed vicarious citizenship, to sort of think about how just because neighborhoods gentrify doesn't mean that that the story ends there for those that are displaced residentially. They come back, they worship in their churches, they party in their bars, and that's the basis around which they develop this attachment to community.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to be something we'll talk about a little bit more, is how we define community and attachment.
Yes.
Right? You hit a couple of times this concept of residential, non-residential. So before we go a little deeper, I want us to talk about, why is Dupont a gay neighborhood? How did that come about? In one page of your book, you quote a 1983 article from the Washington Post. Linda Wheeler was chronicling urban pioneers in gay spaces, and you titled your chapter, DC is Our Dupont Now. So can you tell us a little bit, why is Dupont a gay neighborhood? How has it changed over the decades that have passed and come to now?
That's a fascinating question, because On the one hand, Dupont Circle became the Gayborhood because it was the last Gayborhood standing. One of the things we take for granted was the fact that, in many ways, to quote the historian David K. Johnson, DC was one big gayborhood. It was a very gay city. It's always been a gay city. So, you know, in the heydays, in the 60s and 70s, in addition to Dupont Circle was very kind of ordinary and average for a long time. People went to Georgetown, they went to Capitol Hill. Black queer people were congregating in Shaw near Howard University. They had their own particular spaces. I think one of the things that contributed to the emergence of Dupont Circle were some of the major cultural and political institutions. So Lambda Rising coming into Dupont Circle, you know, the community center that housed a number of supportive LGBT organizations, as well as the Pride Parade, the first several Pride festivals. But I always remember the writer Edmund White, when he was doing his research about queer spaces in the United States, the one thing that this fine Dupont Circle was, despite being able to party in Georgetown and go to the O Street bars, was that Dupont was a gay neighborhood because of its quote unquote dulcet conventionality. Okay. He liked the fact that you could go to Kramer's and people were sitting in suits, having conversations, gay men having conversations, as if it was no different from everyone else. Right. I think what made Dupont sort of, again, rise in as the major gay hub was then the concentration of institutions as other places began to slowly close down. Mm-hmm. So I remember being a student at Georgetown many years ago, and there was the P Street Strip and Connecticut Avenue, 17th Street, of course, and then as it began to change and it begins to shift and became 17th Street, Dupont Circle became known as a gayborhood because of its symbolic value. All the years that we put in to sort of create those spaces, to create the space of Dupont as a safe space for us to be out in public and queer, was what now makes Dupont Circle so unique. And that's one of the things that I want to highlight in the book, that, you know, the gay neighborhood as a gay neighborhood is kind of a relatively recent thing in terms of what we've been doing and how LGBT people have been creating geographies for themselves over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so my concepts are really tying back to not simply the gay neighborhoods, but I think to the processes of placemaking, community building, world building, geography making.
And I want to jump in and talk about the placemaking, but especially you mentioned the 19th century.
Yes.
Right, 19th and 20th century. We are in a 200-year-old city, right? This is a place marred by racist segregation, battles against desegregation, right? We've always had a white Washington, a black Washington, right? There's always been the federal Washington and the local Washington, right? So you referred to cultural institutions being made in places, that Dupont has become this neighborhood, but it's not always been an accessible neighborhood for all of Washingtonians.
Correct.
Right? So can you break down for us a little bit about Dupont Circle and the white divide, black divide that we see in the city?
Yeah, so one of the surprising things that people realize is that, well, yes, DC for a long time was very much a southern city until around the 1930s and 1940s. And there were segregated spaces for white and black LGBT people, with a couple of rare exceptions. So public parks were desegregated. So Lafayette Park, Lafayette Square, which is one of the earliest cruising sites in the city, were integrated spaces. Black people and white people could come and engage in cruising, right? They could go to the mall, they can go to some of these other public spaces. It was during the colder months when then you began to see, in the early 20th century, gay white men going to the downtown DC establishments, the YMCA, the movie houses. But interestingly enough, in Shaw near Howard University, black gay people were creating parallel worlds. There was a YMCA there. There was a movie house there where they congregated. There were private house parties. And the important thing to remember for black LGBT people, because of segregation, they could not have the freedom to move about in the city in the same way. So they were in eyesight of family and friends. They were in eyesight of people that went to church with them. And so they had to be visible, invisible in plain sight. sight. That's sort of that hidden in plain sight, as they say. And so they were able to find and establish and develop these very vibrant communities in a variety of different spaces and places that ultimately did push back against some of the Black middle class and Black elites. But I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that there were many different spaces throughout the city that supported LGBT communities, both in terms of white and Black DC. And then as we saw the coalescence of places like Dupont Circle, and particularly in the 60s and 70s, you did begin to see a lot of tensions around access to gay bars, Black men being required to have multiple forms of identification, or sometimes being excluded, dress codes being implemented. Some of the things I even encountered when I was participating in this scene in the 90s and early 2000s. And what has been interesting is the fact that those Black LGBT communities sometimes have responded in very different ways in the later part of the 20th century. Sometimes they do stand up and mobilize and challenge the way they did with the Club Lost and Found in the 1970s. In other forms, they retreated and go back into their own queer spaces and create their own, there were a number of Black queer bars and Black queer nightclubs and other kinds of events.
What I'm hearing from you is that you have got this really clear understanding of the Black experiences and the white experiences and some of the overlap between the two.
Absolutely.
In your book, which is wonderful, by the way, thank you for writing it.
Thank you.
In your book, very rarely do you actually get into your biographical background and your navigating being an outsider and an insider.
Yes.
Right? But you just went down this path. I feel like you opened the door, and so I'm gonna walk right through it, right? As a gay Black man, and you describe this, also being a professor, because most of us are not with a PhD, in living in this city and doing this research, can you tell us a little bit about your biography? How have you navigated getting to this seat right now as both an outsider and an insider? How has that affected how you see gayborhoods and how you understand it coming up with this vicarious citizenship?
Yes.
How have you navigated that?
Absolutely. So I grew up in Los Angeles, California. I was not originally from DC, although everyone now thinks that I am from DC somehow for some strange reason. But I grew up in the 90s. I wasn't out at the time. I had a wonderful life. I went to some amazing schools. I have some friends in the audience I went to high school with, very excited about that. Did debate, never really thought about, these kinds of concerns until I came to DC. I was a student at Georgetown University, and coming out at Georgetown. So coming out in a conservative Catholic university in the late 90s, right around the time of September 11th, I began to experience racial discrimination in a real way for the first time. Knowing what it's like to have taxi cabs pass by you as you're trying to hail a cab. Going to bars where you had to wait in line while bartenders served white patrons. The experience, there was one time I went on a date with someone and they said, "You're a really great guy, it's a shame you weren't born white." There were all these different levels of experience and experiences that I also knew some of my Black gay friends were also encountering and having as well. So it always sort of fascinated me to sort of look at more at the history, understand my identity as a Black gay man. And there weren't a lot of studies out there. There weren't a lot of things that explored that experience. A lot of it comes from the white gay perspective. And so I decided, after graduating from Georgetown, I took a few years off. I was fortunate enough to have a wealth of friends who encouraged me that I talked enough about these issues that I should go and study it. And so I did choose to pursue a Ph.D. in sociology at Northwestern. And it was right around the time that I took a class on race and place where there were tensions arising between a historic Black church and a gay bar opening across the street in Shaw. And so the questions of, then all of a sudden people began to have these conversations about Shaw becoming a gay neighborhood because white gay men were moving into the neighborhood and now beginning to change the fabric of it. And so that's what pretty much started this journey for me to understand these dynamics. And then on top of that, as I was studying sexuality, again, the illusion of racial difference in studies, that became very important. So when I decided to pick a site and study gay geographies, I picked Washington, D.C. deliberately because I could not avoid talking about Black people. I really wanted to talk about the Black queer experience. I really wanted to center it, not only in terms of the dynamics, but also highlighting the fact that yes, we might have been casualties of gentrification, but we also had a lot of agency, we also had a lot of celebration, a lot of play, a lot of ways in which we expressed our identities in very particular ways. And again, the Black queer experience is aligned as an important part of the framework that I developed. The notions of placemaking that people might have thought of as negative, right? It's the things that originated in Black gay communities. And white gay people, scholars now want to draw attention to those spaces because we see it in white queer communities because of what's happening in places like Dupont Circle. But I didn't want to erase, right, the important contributions of Black people in this really positive way. It's deviant until all of a sudden it infiltrates into the mainstream. And so I really wanted to put Black queer experiences into the center as part of that moment as well.
Yeah, I think that's important. I also want to say I'm sorry that guy said that to you.
Oh, don't worry. I was very resourceful.
I'm sure you were, but I hope you and everybody else recognize Black as beautiful.
Well,
and he shouldn't have said that. He shouldn't have said that. But having touched on that point, I think it's, before we move to the next one, I want us to also say that you are talking about racism, both from straight people towards Black people and gay white people towards gay Black people.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, you're hitting on both of those elements.
Absolutely, and one of the things, especially doing the historical research, some of the earliest records of gay life in the district come from white gay men who actually had very strong opinions, racial opinions about Black people. They had a particular bench that they gave a particular name to, that they wanted to avoid at all costs. Early studies that looked at Black gay events as these cast in a very specific kind of way that drew on stereotypes of hypersexuality, as well as I think the exclusion of Black gay people, gay men and lesbians from gay white spaces. After the Supreme Court in 1954 sort of desegregated restaurants, and again, it's something vital to remember about the district. We didn't have bars, right, because of, after Prohibition, there were restaurants where, again, they might have been family friendly in the day and people knew what time to get out of them before it became gay. Once those restaurants were desegregated, restaurants would actually put reserve signs on tables to prevent Black gay people from entering, right? I think it's important to realize that we do have this very complicated history that we continue to wrestle with. But on the other hand, in the 26 years I've been in the district, it's also heartening to see ways in which we find this incredible visibility and diversity that now is within the community. We're having these conversations more. And again, part of what I want to do is not just simply think of us as casualties of racism and segregation, but also give us a reason to celebrate the accomplishments of a legacy of what Black people have done in this city.
Well, and I would like to shift, from those comments also to some of the racial implications around the Pulse Massacre. So to frame it and remind people, in 2016, the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida was attacked by a racist, homophobic gunman who killed 48 revelers that were inside and wounded 53 more. That was at the time the largest mass atrocity gun violence event in our country and the largest attack against gay people. It was primarily a Latin space because that was the Latin night that day. And so In talking about that and talking about that race, I also want to bring our Latin siblings into the conversation, and reference the fact that this book project and Vicarious Citizenship is very different because of that Pulse Massacre, right? So we've talked about this in the past. You came up with this idea and these concepts around the Vicarious Citizen. You named it, an old concept, based on living here, experiencing it, doing all of this research. And you had a pretty good framework for your book at the time. 2016 was a bit back. And when this event occurred, I had been under the impression that your chapter about Pulse was going to be the epilogue to your book. And then for those of us who've read it and opened the front, you see it's actually the introduction. It's become the introductory chapter to this book. So it's a big, long story, and I'm giving you a big question here. But can you explain for us Vicarious Citizenship and what did that mean about the Pulse Massacre and what you saw here in Dupont Circle?
Yes, and the reason why it became the introduction from an epilogue, I initially came here to celebrate the Pride Festival, Capitol Pride, and I thought that was going to be the closing part of the book. And right when I got here, there was an article that came out that asked whether or not DC, the title was DC no longer has a central gay neighborhood, does it matter? And so it focused on the fact that, you know, people once upon a time thought of Dupont Circle as queer central, or the Fruit Loop, right, the center of queer life. And then all of a sudden, right, we see this diffusion happening, we see the bars disappearing, we recognize the fact that new generations of LGBT citizens do not necessarily feel the need to go to Dupont Circle the same way that their forebears did. And then, so there was this argument, and I kind of felt this sense of sadness as I was watching the parade. In some ways, both celebration and sadness, because I went to the Pride Parade, and it was wonderful to see parents and children, to see corporations. I guess you can debate that, right? Supporting the visibility and respect of queer culture. This is a year after the Obergefell decision that granted marriage equality in the United States. There were a lot of people sort of questioning the relevance of it. And then all of a sudden, within a moment, right, we wake up the next day, we hear about this tragedy, and where did we go to? We went to Dupont Circle. We went to the Pride, we went to the festival on Pennsylvania Avenue, but during that time, the conversations were that there would be a vigil that night at Dupont Circle. So we converged in Dupont Circle that night. And for the next several days, it became the center of LGBT life in the city again. And that happened around the world. Everybody, in a time when people said gay neighborhoods are no longer necessary, as soon as this tragedy happened, we went to the Stonewall Inn in the Village. We went to the Castro. We went to Boys Town and all these places that people said no longer mattered. And so what it led to me to realize, I thought Vicarious Citizenship required there to be some kind of residue of a particular institution or space, a bar, a queer bookstore, in case of Black communities, Black churches. And in that particular moment, all we needed was the memory of what Dupont Circle represented, the symbolic importance. And we turned on Dupont Circle as gay again. And then once we didn't need it anymore, it went right back to normal. So we took that space, we made it our own again, right? And so that led me to more research, and I advise people, don't do 12 years of research on a project like this, especially when you're trying to get tenure.
Which you got, and you got a ton of awards while doing this research, so it was worth it.
Well, thank you. Right? But what mattered was I realized that when we need something, when we need this particular space, if it's a part of our history and we remember it, we can take it over, use it as we need to mobilize and bring the community together, and just as quickly turn it off again. And so I developed another concept combined with Vicarious Citizenship, called place reactivation, to sort of think about the fact that even though space is a geographic area, right, what makes it place is the fact that everybody puts meaning into it. We have shared meanings and traditions that we can sort of map on to these spaces. That's what we did with Dupont Circle after the tragedy at Pulse nightclub.
Right, and I have that here, reactivating and reclaiming LGBTQ geographies. I wanted to add, I liked how you said we went here, we went there, because it shows, I mean, you didn't go to all those places. We were here together, but you named all those other cities as if we're all together in every Gayborhood, right? That there was this sense of pulse, regardless of where you were, we all were there, right? And my recollection was here in DC, the weekend it was, we have our parade on Saturday,
Yes.
right? And then our festival is on Sunday. So for activists who are up at dawn working the festival, we weren't out at the dance club necessarily, right? So we woke up to the news, right? That was our morning cup of coffee, was that news, very shocked. And we went down to activate and reclaim what is Pennsylvania Avenue.
Yes.
Right? In the heart of the nation's capital, where the presidents march when they get inaugurated, where the KKK marched in the 20s for their demands as well.
Yes.
Right? We go down there to make it a very gay space, and we were pretty scared.
Yes, we were.
We were pretty angry, and there were hundreds of thousands of us down there, and somehow, like you said, we all found our way back to Dupont Circle.
Yes, and I think what's important, I think there's two things from what you said is important. I think the global solidarity of going back to the gay neighborhoods, right, the iconic gay neighborhoods, is very, very important for us to remember, that we were all united together in Orlando by going back and reactivating those spaces. But I also remember that day was also a day of immense confusion. The news stories were coming in as we were going through the day. And again, the vigil that was happening was spread by word of mouth. And so the power of us being able, in the face of, after this major shooting that takes place, and a lot of us feel scared, I think Bob the drag queen said it best when he performed, right? That the best thing we could have ever done was to come together, to be there in a physical space. Because, we're telling people, we're sending a clear message that we're not going anywhere. And so again, what I love about doing this research is for LGBT people, placemaking is the most powerful tool in our cultural community and our political arsenal. I mean, you think about Stonewall and the riots that happened in 1969. They just didn't happen, that people who lived in the village. It was people that came from all over New York to be on Stonewall that night. And then it happened several days later because people kept calling. The word of mouth kept building. They went to their space and they protected their space from, again, the kinds of threats to their existence. And I think that's something that's in our DNA, and I love that.
Yeah, I do too. I want to keep going with this reclaiming and reactivating space, but shift it to the fact that you've come here this weekend.
Yes.
Because on Tuesday, October 29th, we are having the 38th annual high heel race right around the corner from the hotel that we're in right now. It's on 17th Street. It's been happening since 1986. So I wanted to get you to tell us a little bit about how that event reactivates the space and uses some of your theories in practice, right? Like, let's really flush out a little bit more of what a vicarious citizen means and what's going to happen on Tuesday. I'll frame for those that are watching who haven't shown up to the race before. It happened, and correct me if I get my facts wrong. 1986, a bunch of drag queens ran along the sidewalk, about 24 drag queens, from JR's bar to the upstairs bar at Annie's, took a shot, and ran back to JR's, took a shot, and the winner got the bar tab paid for, right? And it's gone on over the years. It's gotten bigger and bigger, took over the streets, got louder and noisier. 1991, it was prohibited from happening, and when the people showed up, the cops beat them up really, really badly. And the gay community mobilized against police brutality, which has clearly been solved. Right? And we got the police chief to apologize. There was a lesbian photographer who had recorded the police brutality. Thank you, lesbian videographers. And the police apologized. It was part of us gaining our political power here in the 90s. The event has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger since those years, and now is a Washington tradition. We've got the TV coming, the news broadcasters, everyone comes to this local neighborhood event. So the 3 blocks of P Street of 17th Street are gonna fill with about 10,000 people for the evening to watch drag queens run for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, down the street in their heels. So can you now tell us a little bit about that race and how it activates the space? You've talked a bit about how the neighborhood has changed, how they've moved on. We're moving to other parts of the city. What does it mean to be having them all come back and turn this one night into this one event? How is that a vicarious citizen?
Oh, it takes me back to the story I actually bring into the book. There was one of the races that I observed, there was a gay couple showing affection on the street while the performers were using this 17th Street as the catwalk, right? And right next to them were these parents, and the father had a daughter perched on his shoulder, and he tapped one of the gentlemen that were just, it wasn't really heavy making out. They were just, pecking each other, showing public affection. Asked him to stop doing it because the behavior was inappropriate. Now keep in mind, right, you're on a street watching drag queens, right, moving up and down the street, playing out, scenes from Dynasty, playing out scenes from, Absolutely Fabulous. And in most places, that might have been an intimidating factor. But for the gay couple, they said, what do you mean it's inappropriate? This is our neighborhood, this is our street. And the mother actually came back and said, you're lucky that people like us in Dupont Circle support events like this. That we're here to celebrate diversity. We're here to expose our child to something different. And you should be lucky that we're here to support you. Well, that
wait. So the straight couple told the gays to stop kissing,
Yeah.
gay kissing, and to be grateful that they support them.
Yes, which did
Got
not go well for the gay couple because they
Got it.
bleeped out a bunch of expletives. There were other queer people standing around, and the pecking turned into real hot and heavy making out, and it really drove the straight couple away. Why that is an important lesson and an important exercise of vicarious citizenship is because 17th Street, in a lot of ways, is ours. We feel comfortable walking up and down there holding hands. If someone yelled an expletive, we feel more comfortable mobilizing and challenging it because we have an imagined community of people around us that we think would have our backs if something like this happens.
So do you think that wouldn't have happened in another neighborhood if there were 2 gays kissing any other place in town?
Well, one of the things I found is that more people feel comfortable doing it on 17th Street than they would on 9th Street than they would in Georgetown. Again, 17th Street has a very symbolic significance as a gay neighborhood. And one of the reasons why is because people feel a comfort in being out in that space because it belongs to the LGBT community. They can, they feel this kind of connection. The exceptions can be outside of queer spaces and bars. I had an example of one person who loved engaging in, in dressing in drag, but they always describe the fact that they, as comfortable as they feel sashaying up and down 17th Street or going along 14th and P Street in front of number 9 or near Trade, as soon as they walk out of those spaces, they get into an Uber to go to their home, right? In a different neighborhood because they don't necessarily feel safer being able to express themselves in that way. And so one of the things about the high heel race, I think it is, especially as we see the neighborhood, as we once upon a time saw it straighten, and now, through the enormous efforts of, people, our local politicians and interested people working to preserve it through various forms of cultural expressions. I mean, the new murals on 17th Street are fantastic. The tradition of painting the side, the crosswalks for Pride are these really important steps. What we begin to draw on is these really powerful reminders of what the community means to us, and it gives us that entitlement to be able to police behavior we feel that it's inappropriate, and telling a gay couple not to express their love on the gay street underneath the rainbow flags, and now the new gorgeous high heels is an inappropriate expression.
And one of the gayest nights of the year.
The gayest nights of the year.
Right.
It's the extreme and the power of it, I think, is what also makes it even more exciting. I think particularly as we're seeing the institutional complexion of 17th Street change, right? With Cobalt now having closed. There's only a couple.
Chaos is gone.
Chaos is gone. I mean, you have JR's, you have Dupont Italian Kitchen, and you have Annie's, which is really the true anchor of 17th Street and Dupont Circle, and that's not a gay bar at all. We made it gay.
We made it gay.
We made it gay, and we made it gay in concert with the women who worked there, who said it's okay for you to hold hands on top of the table, not underneath. And that was why in the '68 riots, as rioters were moving, the gay people came and protect that part of the town because that was their space, their sense of entitlement. And so the high heel race is connected to all of those forms and traditions. And now it's consolidated, I think, particularly as the parade route for Capitol Pride has also moved away from 17th Street. It becomes one of the enduring symbols of our community and who we are.
Yeah, definitely. I want to ask, before we go on to talking about some of the oral histories that you've done in the individuals, because the guy you were just mentioning was interesting. You opened the door there a little bit to talk about women.
Yes.
And I want to talk about misogyny.
Yes.
Because I find it a fascinating and interesting problem we don't talk about. So earlier we were discussing the racism, the white and the black, right? Both within the white gaze and the black gaze. But can we hear a little bit about hatred towards women? And how does that look with vicarious citizenship, with neighborhoods, with us as cis men? We're two people, but there's no women here on the stage with us.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about your theories and about women and the misogyny, and what does that look like in gayborhoods?
Well, I mean,
straight women, gay women.
I mean, we can start off with the fact that by the time I started, there were no real physical, spots for queer women. There were nights that supported. I used to love going to ladies' nights at Cobalt. I thought the music was far more amazing than going to some of the other dance parties. But there really weren't a lot of spaces for, queer women to congregate. And I think, unfortunately, it is one of the shortcomings to my book. I have not been able to really understand those those geographies to the same extent as I did for the majority. I think of, it's funny to think about in the early part of the 20th century, even though, a lot of the spaces were LGBT, were gay friendly, queer women could only go out to these spaces if they were accompanied by gay men, right? There has been a very big issue in terms of spaces that were lasting. We know we've had them. We had them. They were very vibrant spaces that supported community for queer women, and yet, for some reason they continue to sometimes elude us. I think. Now that we have a few more spaces that support queer women, like a League of Their Own and some of the other spaces, and I'm excited, perhaps in my next project, or if someone takes up the study, to understand what those dynamics really are. I think it is a real tragedy that we often, our lesbian sisters were really there for us in the AIDS crisis, and when we don't need them, we just say thank you next. I think that's a really big problem.
And the AIDS crisis is actually what brought me that question. Years ago, we did a panel on lesbian leadership during the AIDS crisis. And since that time, Rainbow History Project has really been looking at the problems of underdocumented abilities into doing lesbian history. There's a lot of really good stuff out there.
Yes.
The new book, I think it's called A Space of Her Own.
Yes.
I just picked up talking about spaces for women. Because this is your theory book. Is it safe to assume or say that you're looking for some scholars to take your approaches and look at women's spaces and really start applying your theory to some of what else needs to be studied? I
definitely think so. I believe that, the spaces that supported queer women when I was here were spaces that were reactivated once a month, a couple times a month. I think that, it was often in the softball leagues or the various other kinds of events, right, that queer women were able to find community in that particular way. I think there is something to also be said about vicarious citizenship. We also recognize the fact that queer women, as women, still make less than men do, even gay men, and that closes out possibilities and opportunities for them to be able to, afford sometimes to live in gentrifying or gentrified neighborhoods like iconic gay neighborhoods once were. And that is, what the literature has once upon a time supported was the fact that queer women were often some of the early pioneers in a lot of these spaces that then became gay neighborhoods to a certain extent. I think about in Chicago how the neighborhood Andersonville, which was once known as Girls Town, became known as Mandersonville after the gay population came in and displaced them.
Mandersonville.
Mandersonville.
Man.
Yes, M-A-N.
Well, there's this thing, mansplaining. It's about men explaining. So it doesn't surprise me about Anderson.
And there's a lot of reasons why people theorize about it, and I don't want to get into some of them. I think that a lot of them, some of the earlier reasons were a good effort attempts to sort of connect it to feminist politicking, which I think is problematic. Women do have territorial aspirations to create physical spaces to protect themselves. So they don't necessarily always look like what gay men have done in terms of bars. Sometimes they're bookstores, sometimes they are countercultural spaces, performative spaces that allow a certain level of expression and certain forms of conversation to take place. They're often spaces that do embrace diversity and ways that are very different than unfortunately how we might have seen it in community with gay men. So there is all sorts of opportunities, and I hope that my frameworks and my concepts can be springboards for people to think about and theorize what these spaces are and what they look like and what they mean in this particular time.
Yeah, and I think that's going to happen. We got a new lesbian-owned coffee shop, and during the pandemic, we just got a new lesbian-owned restaurant named Her. So it's right there. I think students are going to put your ideas forward. Just watching our time, I want to switch and kind of have our last question. Ask you to give us a couple of your approach to oral histories, and how you did some direct interviewing.
Yes.
Right? This was a lot of theory that you came up with. But what you taught me was that you did all of the books that other people had written. You used a lot of oral history archives that other people had done, and you did a lot of your own interviewing.
Yes.
There were two really interesting ones I'd like you to maybe mention or talk about. You had said your friend Viet with wearing the clothes here and there and everything else, and also your friend Jordan.
Yes.
So if you could kind of share some of those with us and how that looked in the book.
Yes. One of the major goals I had with this particular book, I think when scholars approach gay neighborhoods and queer nightlife, they often will interview the icons, the pioneers, the owners, bar managers. And I wanted to really think about how people live their lives on the street every day. I was very fortunate enough to have a wonderful repository such as the Rainbow History Project, where I did not have to spend I would have loved to have the time to interview Frank Kameny and, Deacon McCummon, but there were no new questions. These oral histories are amazing. They're comprehensive. They gave me a lot of really wonderful things to think about in terms of the upper level, but I really wanted to think about how people embodied these geographies in their everyday lives. And so, we talked a little bit about Viet already in terms of what I appreciated was this kind of tension that a lot of my interlocutors, the residents and everyday people, thought about the gay neighborhood. And the example of Jordan is interesting because he moved here to DC from Chicago, and he was deliberate about wanting to live in a gay neighborhood. And he asked people, where's the gay neighborhood? And they said, you need to move to Shaw. You need to move, you need to go there. That's where all the queer people are going. So he moved there. And he did find a gay neighborhood. His neighbors were gay. There were rainbow flags up and down the streets. There were cars with equality signs. But it wasn't a gay neighborhood he was looking for, right? He was looking for a place that probably resembled his place in Boys Town, which had that combination of the nightlife as well as the residential component, right? Where you walk out the street and it's basically exploding rainbows. And so one of the things that he said that stuck to me was the fact that, apparently there are multiple different kinds of gay neighborhoods, ones that are residential and ones that are commercial. And I think that's very true. I think there's a lot of ways in which now, we live in neighborhoods where we have a lot of residents that are gay. They're living their lives every day. They're parents now, pushing, driving, kids to soccer practice in their Subarus. I mean, I'm very Maine, so I don't know if you drive Subarus.
I ride a bike, so I don't know
but
what a Subaru is.
At the same time, I think there is still the need for these kinds of symbolic places for people to live their lives publicly. And that was what I think he was really gesturing to. In the same way, I think for Viet, right? The idea that he might feel comfortable in his home, inviting friends over to watch RuPaul's Drag Race, for example. But there is something about walking out of the street or walking down the street that still gives him a bit of pause, except when he goes to these particular spaces where he feels that he is welcome and that he can express himself openly and feel empowered. And so that was what I was really trying to go for with the book. I really wanted to speak to the everyday lived experience and the diversity of those experiences as well.
Yeah. And I love that thought that you said there are different kinds of gay neighborhoods. I think that's what I'm seeing and experiencing here in this one and the other ones I visited to, is there's a lot of different types of them and they're changing over time. I'm gonna thank you. Thank you for this book. Thank you for all your work over the years. I think it's fascinating. It's definitely something everybody should read more than once. Not in My Gayborhood, the Gay Neighborhoods and the Rise of the Vicarious Citizen. I think we have some time for some questions from the audience, if that's okay with everybody. I don't have a watch, so it's kind of up to y'all to tell me. I've got some time. If anybody has a question for the professor, please go ahead, speak clearly or so, and then I'm gonna read it back for the recording. First. No, if they go loudly, I'll read it for the recording again.
I was just curious, since, vicarious citizens are having to enter these spaces, if in your research you looked into accessibility in terms of getting there. So what do bus lines look like, or metro, or walking, or people who have a car, are they parking, and how that kind of affects the ability for a place to create that culture and maintain that culture over time.
Thank you. So the question was the relationship with people traveling to a gayborhood. How are they getting there, leaving there, the non-residents, right? Public transit, private cars. How is that affecting neighborhoods and how people engage with it as a vicarious citizen?
No, that's a fantastic question. I think, one of the benefits for the iconic gay neighborhoods often, at the time that I researched them, they are surrounded, they're very well accessible, right? In terms of either metro stations, L stations, bus lines. What I find really interesting is going back to my Andersonville concept. When it was Girls Town, one of the reasons why it was, it was situated there was because it was a mile away from the L station. The idea of women sort of walking down dark streets at night still kind of posed a particular kind of danger. And so for the iconic queer spaces, and I want to pause almost for a second, because I was thinking about the times when, in my early days of being a student here, where we would go to places like Nation, we would go to places like Trax or The Edge, where there were times when taxi drivers wouldn't necessarily take you if you were the wrong color, but would either take you there, would stay at that particular site, and then not take you any other part of Southeast. But for the most part, accessibility in terms of getting to these particular places has not been as much of a concern. People seem to access them easily. And again, how a lot of the spaces sort of blossom residentially is the fact that they are adjacent to the iconic gay neighborhood. So people often kind of balloon outward from those spaces. I think it's probably one of the reasons why also too, places like Georgetown may not have survived as a gay neighborhood, even though it once was, because there is no metro station there. And so, I think accessibility plays an important part in not only And I'll say this, it's not only in terms of accessing these spaces, but for new generations to also access them and for that to be part of their memory too, so that they can continue to make these traditions possible.
Yeah, and I think it's gonna require more research to dig into that, because also women's access to real estate is different than men.
Yes.
Just in terms of who has the money and the access to things. That affects transportation and where you go, where you have spaces. And we didn't talk about it, we're not gonna, but the age divide. The young and the old, who can afford what, who can afford to go where. That's a whole other panel that we're gonna do, so let's ask another question. I'm still the young one, right? Next question, who's got something?
I got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What role does safety play in forming neighborhoods?
Like physical safety?
Yeah, like sometimes I know it did in DC. There's been like a rise of like hate crimes towards like LGBTQ people, and there's been situations where some trans women have been murdered. So how does safety play a role in forming neighborhoods?
Okay, so the question here is about safety and forming gay neighborhoods. Hate crimes, violence against trans people is on the rise, not just in our city, across the country. This is happening. So what is the role of a gayborhood or forming a gayborhood, the safety around it? We talked pulse earlier, but just the day-to-day is what he's asking about.
Yeah, and I think that's important to recognize, because I think I think gay neighborhoods sort of coalesce the way they have because they're supposed to be sites to ensure physical safety and ensure a certain kind of protection. Even if you're not and people are not, communities not cooperating, having a very good relationship with the police, there is still this understanding that there were queer vigilante groups and other things that occurred during the 70s during its heyday. When you add other members of the community to that equation, I think it gets a little more complex. You think about the fact that we had, when I was here in 2019, we had a vigil in Dupont Circle to sort of end the violence that was happening with trans women on Eastern Avenue. And the question is, why are they on Eastern Avenue? Obviously, and created a huge set of problems, right? They were on K Street once upon a time. One of the things to think about are the ways in which even safety for us, safety in terms of a gay neighborhood, often operates to push some of those women out of the neighborhoods to try to find other spaces where they could feel safe to be able to conduct what they need to conduct. And so I think that's where we begin to see some of the fissures. And then when we have these vigils to sort of talk about the violence, what I really appreciated was some of the speakers, some of the survivors who had lived in those spaces, who have survived violent episodes, sort of continue to say, the people in the gayborhoods, right, are clacking their, are speaking up now, but where were you then? And so I think there's a lot for us to continue to have these conversations about, because the extent to which these spaces may be safe but they're not inclusive, therefore they're not safe to certain populations of people, is something that we take for granted until we see these kinds of tragedies taking place.
And just to clarify for people, Eastern Avenue is not Dupont Circle.
No, it is not.
It's clear on the other side of town.
Yes.
And so holding vigils in Dupont Circle for violence against our siblings on the other side of town. Didn't you talk about that a little bit?
I did, because once we went to it, I was with some friends, and someone asked the question. This is a very important issue, but why are we having something happening over there, talking about something happening over there, happening here? Like, why is it that we are concerned about what's going on at Eastern Avenue, and why is Dupont Circle the site for us to come together? And I thought that was a really powerful question, because we want to say that the community is diverse and it's expansive, and yet as we see our sisters becoming casualties of violence, casualties of poverty, casualties of discriminatory systems that keep them from finding jobs, from finding housing, from finding opportunities to live their lives as they choose to. We can sometimes sit here somewhat comfortably, and I think there was, if I'm not mistaken, Right before that vigil happened, there was an incident with a gay white couple that was close to Dupont Circle that also happened, right? That brought a lot of people there. And even listening before the vigil started, there were people sort of, you know, when people had signs about the trans women and the violence against trans women, people were sort of felt that they were, you know, it was a bait and switch almost, right? That, you know, you brought us here because we're worried about the violence happening a couple blocks away, and now you're talking about what's happening to trans women. I mean, I think there's so many myopia that we need to really think about in terms of community and how to ensure safety and how to ensure safety in these spaces. I know that's a real far away answer to that question, but I really think it's an important one to highlight.
And I think, and I'll say this to all the questions, I think it's going to need more research.
Yes.
Right? I think people are going to have to take your theory and dig specifically into that question, and probably the next question too. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm going to comment and question. I think the incident you may be referring to was the Petworth incident of the gay couple, but also the comment is that the Eastern Avenue is also, when you know DC, it's a border. So that was also a intentional thought of the workers, of the women that were there, that they could just go to either side of the street and also feel safe from, you know, the law enforcement as well. So that's another reason why Eastern Avenue was chosen. But my
let me clarify that for the record here.
Yes.
He was saying that Eastern Avenue is the border between DC and Maryland, and the people that are in that area and being victims of violence go back and forth between the two jurisdictions to avoid and be with the police and what's happening out there. So it's a jurisdictional problem
avoid
as well.
arrest, right? If you're out there, you know, doing something that's deemed illegal, that you can just cross the street, then there's no, you know, jurisdiction to you. But I would ask you to comment, Professor, could you comment on how neighborhoods grow out of, I'm trying to think of how to ask this, because I was thinking because it came from that question there, but how neighborhoods grow out of necessity as well as commercial social space grow out as well. So you see both of those things happening at the same time: residents, social space, or social space, residents. So could you talk about how that happens? Comment on how that happens?
Yes.
Here, especially here in DC. Like Shaw's a great example, right? When I think of Shaw, and I think of Black Shaw.
Yeah, can you quickly frame for us the relationship between the commercialization and the residency coming back and forth?
Yes, and that's a perpetual chicken or egg question, because it depends on the development of the specific neighborhood. You know, Dupont Circle kind of emerged because eventually there were gay people living there, and they were using the circle as a cruising area, particularly as Lafayette Square was getting more and more police in the 1950s and 1960s. During the famous Lavender Scare, where they were trying to root out homosexuals from government jobs, and over time that became sort of the institution sort of followed it. But then you think about Logan Circle, it became popular primarily because you saw a lot of you saw gay bars and spaces begin to come in, and people began to move further over. And so I think it definitely is a combination of the two, and it is, I think people definitely do see opportunities in particular neighborhoods for a variety of different reasons, whether it's accessibility to work. The number one reason why people selected where they lived was 100% in terms of the 115 people I interviewed. It was access to their jobs. That's classic DC, right? That was the reason why they chose the neighborhood they chose. And sometimes they moved into residential areas where then the gay institutions followed. The interesting thing about Shaw, what I find fascinating, gay white people have been living in Shaw well before 2006, when B-Bar tried to open across the street from Scripture Cathedral. The problem was that you now have a physical, cultural presence identifying the queer community, right, that for a lot of people went against what the neighborhood was all about. A lot of the gay people that lived there knew and loved their neighbors. They integrated themselves to a certain extent with a certain level of distance, and I think that we that could be argued or debated, but it was the presence of the gay bar that created the problems. So it definitely is contingent on a variety of circumstances that might lead people to let gay neighborhoods to sort of emerge, whether it's from the residential side first, and some of them stay residential. You know, people sometimes fight to prevent, you know, bars and things like that from coming in. And then there's other times when it is commercial, and then there's housing opportunities around that. Or there's housing opportunities in neighborhoods adjacent to it so that they can be able to access it when they want to. And then you have it and it disappears, and we worry about it, like what happened in 17th Street with the moratorium.
Yeah, and I'm gonna go out on a ledge here and say I think we're gonna need more research.
Yes, we
into
do.
that, right? Right.
Well, and again, I think that the issue with it is it's going to be so, it's going to shift and change so much. And I think we need to do more places. We need to do research in different places, not just the New Yorks and San Franciscos and Los Angeleses. We need to really be able to go into, you know, southern places, look at Atlanta, look at all these other geographies to understand, right, the ways in which these places emerge.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask our last question of the day. I'm going to thank you again for teaching us all of this stuff today, but I want to ask you too, if you could close up with your research, with your talk, if you could tell the youth of today something, what would you want them to know? If you could tell your younger self something, if you could tell the youth that you used to be something, what would you say?
It is the one lesson I learned from writing the book. We are all placemakers. We all have the potential to come in and produce space and give meaning to geography. So get off the Discord, get off the grinder, and go to your coffee shops and occupy the space. Go to the bars and occupy space. Go on the street corners and occupy space. Play your music, vogue the house down in the middle of the sidewalk. You have the power to be able to create spaces and claim them. And we need that as again, we see you know, new generations coming in, and they are going to need safe spaces to be able to come out and feel that they're completely themselves. That's what I would tell my younger self too, right? We're not just people. I love that, you know, the story about these spaces is the fact that all of a sudden a gay bar comes and all of a sudden we're gay. No, we go into those spaces and give those bars their meaning. So that is what I wanted to leave us with. We're all placemakers.
Yeah, I love that. We are all placemakers. Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Theo Greene, Not in My Gayborhood, The Gay Neighborhoods and the Rise of the Vicarious Citizen. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.